Hello, my name is Randy Kokel, and I'm talking to you regarding a program from Orange Coast Unitarian Universalist Church. This is a program on Unitarian Universalist values and do we have an impact? Do you ever wonder whether the work that we do has an impact in our world? In this workshop, we're going to consider how our values and the work we do as a denomination has an impact. About 10 years ago, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, UUSC, launched a campaign to recognize the human right to water. It was a year-long campaign which encouraged people to think about the price, quality, and availability of water for people throughout the world. As the campaign neared the end, I wondered why we did it. After all, the initiative was just about over, and there was no legislation passed, no demonstrations occurred in the streets, and there was no uproar in the editorial pages. However, what I did not realize is that the ripples of this program continued even today, more than 10 years later. The first wave occurred when the United Nations recognized the human right to water. A second wave occurred in 2012 when Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill making California the very first state in the nation to legislatively recognize a human right to water. And then just a few weeks ago, one of the local regional water boards, and a water board is an organization which was designed to help distribute water and make sure that people have enough water in their region. So one of the regional water boards began discussing how the affordable aspects of the human right to water can be used to evaluate a local desalination plant. Next, I'd like to recognize and thank Lisa Denk, for without her involvement, enthusiasm, and hard work, this program would not exist. And now I want to introduce the Reverend Ranwa Hammamy. She serves as the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California. The UUJM supports UUs around the state in their various justice ministries by providing advocacy, education, and witness opportunities to live out UU values. Ranwa has previously served as a president of DRUM, which is Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries, which is a national organization for UU people of color. She's a self-described UU Muslim and seeks to serve both living traditions in her ministry, encouraging others to grow and learn from each other's gifts. Welcome, Reverend Ranwa.
Randy introduced us to just now in some more detail and what it calls us to now. And so I'm hoping that my PowerPoint will work. So I will get a little bit more into the UU Justice Ministry of California, but just so you have an idea of why on earth am I talking to you about this today. For those who don't know, the Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California is what's called a state action network, and we organize California UUs and UU-aligned Californians around the state to advance justice in California by cultivating and connecting leaders and communities, and by empowering the public voice of those who share Unitarian Universalist values and principles. And we do that by providing access to education, advocacy, and witness opportunities that are in right relationship with communities that are leading the way in this work. And I'll get more into that after we dive into the human right to water. So I want to first center us in this idea of what the human right to water is, and why is water both a sacred and profane, a sacred and lived practical part of our lives. And our chalice lighting comes from the words of Mary Evelyn Tucker that allow us to lean into the both and. The presence of water and its vast cycles distinguishes Earth from the other planets. It is an important part of what gives rise to life on Earth in its immense variety of forms. The dependence of most species on water is evidenced in the unfolding and sustaining of life. The importance of water is recognized in many of the world's religions, where water is used as a symbol and as a sacrament. From early history, when the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water were identified as sacred vessels of life processes to later sacramental uses of water in baptism or purification ceremonies or ingathering. Water occupies a central place in the human imagination and religious consciousness. Realizing then both our natural dependence on water and our religious ritualization of water, it is instructive to reflect on our apparent separation of water into sacred and profane dimensions. Is water something we revere as that which sustains many forms of life, or is it something we simply use to support human life? Is our concern for water reduced to how we use it and manage it for human ends? Is our insatiable damming and diverting of water so that rivers such as the Yellow are drying up, lakes such as Mono are shrinking, and even a huge inland sea such as the Aral is disappearing? The world's religions provide a variety of examples of how water has been regarded as part of a sacred life process, not simply another product for consumption. At the same time, our increased comprehension of the story of evolution as understood by science gives us a renewed appreciation for the role of water in sustaining life. To see water as a source of life, not merely a resource, is the challenge of a new synthesis of science and religion in our time. Chalice is lit with the wisdom of water. And I want to invite us into a grounding, reflective question with those words from Mary Evelyn Tucker. And you're obviously all here because you are curious about what it means to talk about the human right to water, or have some potentially understanding in your own sense of whether it's justice work or faith of what the human right to water means. And I'm curious to hear from you, whether by chat, I don't know if there's capacity to unmute yourselves and share a word or two about what the human right to water means to you. And what I have here on this slide, just for those who are not aware, are a number of images, both drawn or photographed from the Dakota Nations, so the Lakota Nations who have been water protected at Standing Rock, and that call of water is life is one that has resonated with so many environmental activists and indigenous communities in this work. So with all of that considered, what does the human right to water mean to you?
I'll bite. It seems like economic growth, which is what the Western world believes in strongly, is dependent on water. I mean, we couldn't even have LA if it weren't for what happened, with the aqueduct and the Mono Lake and all that. And so it seems like somehow, and I don't know how to figure it out, but the economy is so tied up with water, and we're so addicted to growth. It's hard to figure out what the way out is. Maybe with population increasing, that even makes it worse. So I don't know. You tell me.
Well, this is Tom. Combined with clean air, it almost precedes everything else that we need to be concerned with. If we don't have clean water and enough of it and clean air to breathe, then everything else just doesn't seem to matter that much. I recall meeting somebody one time who was from Australia, and she was here in Orange County, and she was shocked to learn that we water our lawns and gardens with tap water that's drinkable. And she said that's unheard of in Australia, where they have much less water than we do. from natural resources and have to guard it so much more carefully. The idea of flushing toilets and watering your lawn with drinking water was just, she couldn't believe it. She said, and you live in the desert. Amazing.
Yeah, I got that comment. This is Deborah from my second cousin from Norway. He was horrified that we were doing that, that we're using just regular water for the same things Tom just mentioned. We're very lucky, and we're also wasteful when it comes to that.
Yes.
Much better way to do this.
Yes, we're very privileged in Orange County to have a world-class, fantastic reclamation system that recharges the groundwater from the collected wastewater. And we take it for granted. I get the reports on how clean my water is here at my home, and I'm very happy about that. But the right to water to me is an immense responsibility. If you want the water, you have to be responsible for it. And I think that it's everyone's responsibility not only to conserve water, but to learn about what's going on locally with your water, because it is a big deal. And like, if we moved anywhere else, we would be shocked at the water issues. I mean, like Flint, China's trying to take over the Southeast Pacific. They're not letting other people catch the fish in the ocean. They're like, this is our ocean now. Like, who gives them the right to do that? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. What do you think, Ranwa?
Well, I think that there's some segue material there about what the human right to water has meant, and that responsibility piece, especially for being aware of what is happening locally, because there are realities happening locally that are in California, even that we have been working on and continue to need to work on. So as Randy mentioned earlier, there were decades of efforts to finally have an international awareness of the human right to water. And in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution called the Human Right to Water that recognizes the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights. So as Tom mentioned, this idea of if we don't have clean air, if we don't have clean water, nothing else can come up from that. We need clean water for life. Water is life. And so this resolution not only made this explicitly clear in terms of our human right to water at an international level, but it also calls upon states and international organizations to provide financial resources, capacity building, and technology transfers to provide safe, clean, accessible, and affordable drinking water and sanitation for all. So, we're talking about potable water, water that we can drink and eat and cook with, but also access to sanitation. So there was the human right to water and sanitation as a part of that effort. And so that happened in 2010 and was actually in the middle of that period in which California was advocating for something similar at the state level. And so here in California, what we have taken from that effort and from the work that we have been doing in the state, that there are 4 key criteria for what we say with the human right to water. For people in California to have this right to water, that means that water must be safe, it must be affordable, it must be sufficient, and it must be accessible. And those are standards that we have been holding on to for our advocacy work, for our change work, when it comes to ensuring that all Californians have access to their right to water. Unfortunately, we know that there are things that have prevented us from that and continue to prevent us from the human right to water. One of those things is climate change. We know that there are our droughts have been reducing our capacity to just obtain water. There is the deterioration of infrastructure. There are cities and unincorporated communities that are unable to maintain the infrastructure through which their water runs, and it actually contaminates their water. There is the over-extraction of water resources that results in there being shortages of water for communities that desperately need it, and they don't have access and end up needing to purchase bottled water. And similarly, there's the contamination of water resources. You know, California's Central Valley is full of agriculture, both small and large, and the use of fertilizers in those farming methods has resulted in the contamination of groundwater that communities can't drink, and it has actually caused them to become physically ill. And so there is a real water crisis for certain parts of California. And so just to give you some examples, both historically and presently, of some of those examples in California where that human right to water, that human right to safe, accessible, sufficient, and affordable water that is the basis of our lives has been violated. Right now in California, over 1 million Californians lack access to safe, affordable water. That's a scary number when you think about what some of us do have and the resources we have.
Yeah.
And some examples of places where that has happened, where those violations have happened, there was a small town in Seville that the tap water was so high in nitrates caused by fertilizer seeping into their groundwater that they had to use bottled water. In San Gerardo, another small community that had 3 wells from which they drew their water, one by one, they were contaminated. And the community ended up having to pay for a $5 million well that increased the cost of their water monthly from $20 to $113 a month. Another example of where we are witnessing the human right to water being violated in California is among our unhoused or curbside communities that do not have access to sanitation services. For individuals living in encampments, there are limits to where they can find water, especially now with drinking fountains being shut down. There aren't sanitation stations made readily available, and so they don't even have access to the sanitation component, let alone the potability component.
Mm-hmm.
And some of our indigenous communities are also experiencing their violation of the human right to water needed for their cultural and living needs. The Winnemem-Wintu Nation in Northern California have had their homes, sacred sites, and burial grounds destroyed in recent years by the creation of the Shasta Dam, in addition to environmental impact that has devastated local wildlife, and particularly salmon in Northern California. So those are some of the examples. It's not a great picture, but I wanted to do sort of like an interactive quiz to see if folks could identify who among that list that I maybe have described already, or who you think have had their right to water most violated in our state. Who do you think, knowing the ways in which our world has existed and the ways in which I've described some of those violations have existed, who do you think have had their rights most violated? And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change how this share works just give me 1 second because it is sort of like a Jeopardy thing. Get to this way. Had a nice little text setup and then I realized that I did that wrong. All right. We'll see the PowerPoint again. Great. So I have just a selection of communities, but again, this is the interactive part of today, or one of the interactive parts of today. Whose humanity, whose right to water do you think we have violated?
The indigenous people?
Indigenous communities, yes.
I have a strong opinion. I work in housing, and I see that this promise of sprawl forever, endless, infinite building of tract homes has set expectations of the customers that they can live this way forever, and we're destroying the earth in the process. And my opinion is that the very customers that are living in these very expensively infrastructure sprawl homes have been duped. They've been violated. They believe that it's going to always be available, and it never really was fully sustainable.
Oh, and you're talking about folks that have been placed there in sort of temporary housing, or at least from being unhoused?
This, like you said earlier, the cities can't maintain their infrastructure for water. They can't maintain all the other infrastructure for that matter, the roads, the storm drains, the lights, the schools, because the sprawl absorbs so much money to maintain that they think that they're going to get that forever, but cities are going bankrupt. They can't keep it up. So to me, the very people that are buying these homes in sprawl have been given a expectation that violated they're getting the truth that it's not sustainable.
That's not one of the communities on this slide, but that would be something interesting to look into for sure. And yes, along those lines of what has been said as sustainable or is it sustainable?
Well,
I don't know too much
I'm a
about
housing I'm a housing activist, and you might look at the website strongtowns.org, which talks about this bankruptcy of infrastructure that's happening slowly, and that would explain a lot.
Other communities, the hint is I've given you some of those communities already in my earlier slides.
People who live near like farms. The families growing up and probably working near these farms where the runoff and contaminated water, with Roundup and everything else, all of the fertilizer. So they basically just are saying, they don't care about those people being poisoned.
Yeah, the communities in more rural areas are among those because they're not also necessarily near large municipalities with well-maintained public water systems, and so they don't necessarily have access to that. And they use private wells, their own wells.
Yeah, and probably the migrant community that comes and goes to work in the fields, the undocumented people, they get taken advantage of.
Immigrant communities are absolutely one of the more impacted communities in California, and particularly you'll see there are plenty of stories about how the farm workers, the folks that are working on these farms, don't have access to water for their own personal needs. So while the farms are getting water, the workers aren't. Other communities, voices that have been a little shy to talk and want to try to offer a guest or two.
Well, the homeless.
Curbside communities or homeless communities, yeah. Those are also individuals that don't have basic access to be able to wash their hands, go to the bathroom, get water to drink.
Yeah, we're supposed to be washing our hands all the time. And how did they manage to stay safe in the pandemic without access to that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Other communities.
How about minority communities? When I think of Flint, Michigan, it seems like they're always showing African American people.
Yep, communities of color are absolutely on that list as well. A large portion of folks who've had their human right to water violated in our state are Latinx or African American people in California. Because they live in these areas that have been so neglected or disregarded. Other communities. I'm actually going to I'm going to give you one of them. Communities where English isn't necessarily the first or primary language, because one of the things that we'll talk about in California's work for the human right to water, notices that go up about water contamination or water systems aren't always put in languages that people can understand, and particularly in the communities that are most affected. And so they are not receiving those notifications and aren't aware that the water they are using is potentially killing them or causing severe physical harm to them.
Whose humanity have we violated?
I will show the other two so that we can move on to some of the good news. Low-income communities, which, a lot of these communities intersect. So just being aware that, this is where this becomes an issue around environmental racism and environmental classism and the ways that those two intersect. So low-income communities are particularly places where folks are renters and don't necessarily have the ownership status in order to influence their water boards in ways that might be better heard, and tend to have their right to water violated. And then along those lines, there are what are called unincorporated communities. And so these are much smaller communities of, some 700, 800 or less people who live in places that aren't incorporated in California, and so they don't have necessarily any sort of connection to larger water systems, and don't have the representation to share what their experiences are, and aren't represented. So with all of those violations, obviously we know we have to do something. And so there have been a number of groups, and this is just a handful of the folks who were key players in the human right to water effort in California this century, I should say, that have been doing some of this organizing at local and state levels in particular. And so some of these organizations may look familiar. There's the Community Water Center that works regionally in specific regions of California, particularly the Central Valley, Central Coast, working with some of those communities that were on that previous slide to help them advocate for their rights and organize for better water. The Environmental Justice Coalition for Water is also one of those organizations that does this work. I have the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry of California, because back when we were pushing for the human right to water in 2010, 2011, or 2008, really, that's what we were known as. We are now the UU Justice Ministry of California, but our work then was under that title. The Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is our national organization that we often work in partnership with for a lot of human rights work and for advocacy work. Food and Water Watch is another organization, the San Gerardo Cooperative, which is a more local group, and Urban Similas, which is another more local group. And so these are, again, just a handful of some of the groups that are already doing this work. There are many more. There are probably some in your area that you might be able to identify and maybe have conversations like this with in the future. But so folks have been organizing around this work in California. And so some examples of some communities that have been doing this work to shift away from these violations of the human right to safe, accessible, affordable, and sufficient water. There are some examples here. So one is in Stockton, where in about 10 or so years ago, the residents organized to prevent the privatization of city water systems and utilities, because that privatization would have increased the cost significantly for the community there, thereby violating the affordable aspect of that. In Marywood, which was another small community, largely people of color, and just a little bit outside of LA, residents organized to create a public water system because private companies owned their water and they weren't able to get access to clean, safe water. So they organized to actually get a public water system set up to service that town. In San Diego, the Luiseno tribe, they prevented the Gregory Canyon landfill, which would have actually not just created a terrible system for the Gregory Canyon in terms of creating a landfill in an environmental space, but it helped to preserve the water safety of that space and protected their sacred lands and canyon wildlife. So that way groundwater wouldn't have been contaminated by a landfill being there. And then, as I mentioned, in unincorporated communities, these smaller communities that don't necessarily have representation or access to the resources to have safe water or infrastructure built for their water. In 2015, a state legislative effort happened where SB 88, Senate Bill 88, actually made it so that municipalities, so larger municipalities with large infrastructure, would be charged with supporting unincorporated communities within a certain radius, within a certain distance of them. And so there have been local efforts in California to start to dismantle them, these violations of the human right to water. And one of the big ones that happened was in 2008, 2009, where there was a bill, AB 1242, where both the state Senate and Assembly passed this legislation that would have codified this understanding that there is a human right to water in California. And they faced opposition, but still were able to pass it in both houses. And when it got to Governor Schwarzenegger's desk, way back when we had Governor Schwarzenegger, I didn't live in California then, just saw it from a distance. But there were organizers that collected thousands of letters and postcards and made phone calls telling him to sign it into law. He didn't. He vetoed it. And so, unfortunately, that was a blow to the work in 2008 and 2009 to get a statewide legislative codification of the human right to water in California. But we are persistent and resilient in this work. And so in 2011 and 2012, there was another legislative effort with the Human Right to Water Bill package that centered on AB 685. I don't know if you can see these pictures very well, but here you'll see a number of folks organizing at the Capitol. And we have the droplet. I have not been able to find this costume in our storage, and I wish I could because it is quite adorable and I love it. But the droplet went to these events and advocated for safe water for all Californians and the human right to water. And we had individuals as part of our young adult program go and visit legislators and tell them why it was important for us to pass AB 685 and the Human Right to Water Bill package that accompanied it. There were clergy that came out in full faithful support from multiple denominations. And there was a huge push to get AB 685 passed and this large bill package passed. And so among this human right to water bill package, there was AB 685 as the cornerstone that would commit California to a policy understanding that every human being has the right to clean, affordable, and accessible water. So while we had this established at the United Nations, as a state, California still hadn't affirmed that this was our responsibility. And so AB 685 would have directed state, or was written to direct state agencies to include appropriate measures into their regulations and funding criteria consistent with this understanding that all Californians have a human right to water. And the other bills that were a part of this package included AB 938, which said that folks had to put warning notices in multiple languages so that people could actually understand when there were issues with their water. Making sure that there was access to safe water drinking funds under AB 983 would have provided grant funds for particularly impacted communities to be able to have more funding to address their infrastructure. AB 1221 provided access to water pollution cleanup funds, particularly again for low-income impacted communities and indigenous communities whose water sources were being impacted. And SB 244 was one of those bills that also encouraged for building up more infrastructure for unincorporated communities without resources. It passed. AB 685, yay, was signed into law on September 25th, 2012. The process to get there, it had stalled in the previous year due to some implementation concerns. And there had been some opposition to the rights language, or the right to water. And some folks were saying that this would have a negative impact on agriculture and farmers. And those were largely big agri concerns. One of the things that local organizers did around the Central Valley in particular was went and filled up bottles of water with their tap water, which was visibly contaminated, some of it, and poured it all together into a big jug, and then bottled it up into small bottles and delivered them to legislators. And they called it the Central Valley Blend. And so this was a day of action at the state capitol where they brought all of these varieties of contaminated water from around the state, blended them together, and said, would you drink this? To their legislators. So that got the point across again. And so AB 685 states that it is the policy of the state that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitation purposes. And so that is a big deal for us to have been able to codify that in California law. And out of that, before I go into sort of what the best practices and the impact of that have been, are there any questions? I know we're running low on time. I didn't time myself when I prepped this.
How do we make sure that they don't raise the prices that people cannot pay the water bill?
So that's part of the implementation process where, one of the things that folks have been encouraging is participating in your local water board hearings and advocating for the different ways in which where does your water come from? Identifying those pieces. And so I'll get into a little bit of that in a little bit. And that's, again, I think the 201 of this. This is the education. We'll get into advocacy. But yeah, it's a really critical part of the work is identifying where are people trying to raise these prices and how do we ensure that they don't.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Hi. If you would like more information on this topic and see what's going on locally, in the first week of December, there are going to be 4 local organizations who are going to have their own little workshop that are going to be talking about the human right to water, how the water policies here in Huntington Beach are going to affect our prices. We're going to be having the Surfrider Foundation, R4RD, Residents for Responsible Desalinization, and Azul, who represents people of color. And I think maybe a couple people from the Water District are going to join in as well. So if you'd like more information, please send me an email, put your email address in the comments, or contact Lisa. Thank you.
And how about in Newport Beach?
You can participate in that because the water affects everybody here.
Okay. Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks, Randy. Yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, it is we talk about think globally, act locally, and that's one of the things that is so crucial in this work. A lot of this organizing happens at the local level because of the way that our water systems are built. And so listening to what some of the folks are doing at the local level is crucial to this work. So, you know, there are principles and values and best practices that have come out of the human right to water work in California. And, you know, one of the big things is making sure that those who are most impacted, the disadvantaged and marginalized communities in our state, are part of a clearly communicated and accessible decision-making process. So much of what we have seen as the violations of the human right to water have come from practices and policies that have not included folks who are affected, that have not included unincorporated communities, the unhoused, indigenous communities, rural communities, immigrant communities. So one of the things that is absolutely essential is making sure that they are part of the decision-making process about their own water. And so not only attending things, but making sure that other folks know to be a part of that process too, or naming when they're not in those environments. One of the things we have come up with is that, you know, we know it's not perfect right now. The implementation of AB 685, we still have 1 million Californians without access to safe, clean, affordable water. We know that agricultural contamination is still ongoing in California groundwater. But we know that there is still ongoing policy and legislation and advocacy happening at the local level to continue to work on the implementation of this understanding of the human right to water. And I think those are conversations for future sessions, which I think some really great, Randy's upcoming program in December, I think will be a really good one. But some areas where that has been happening, a lot of our indigenous communities have been leading the way when it comes to environmental preservation as an awareness for what we need to do to preserve and protect our waters. We also have folks advocating for what are called lifeline rates or low-income assistance for water through legislative action. So ensuring that folks with lower income have access to guaranteed low rates for their water bills. And then again, some of these organizations like Community Water Center are working locally with residents in those areas to advocate for their access to water and at least provide them with safe water in the process, in the interim. And so when we're thinking about what it means, what comes next? Where does your water come from? Ask that question. Do you know where your water comes from? What is the relationship you have with the water that you access, the water that you use, and the water that you waste? Most of us have some degree of water wasting. That's a reality. Who makes the decisions about the water in your community? Do you know that? Do you know who makes the decision about how is the water accessible? Who makes the decisions about the safety of your water, the affordability, the sufficiency? And then coming back to something that Lisa had said earlier, what is your responsibility to the human right to water? And so this isn't necessarily a call to action on my end, but an invitation to start thinking and reflecting and to start having those deeper and more direct conversations with individuals in your communities and with getting a better understanding of what is happening locally that you can start to impact. So some potentially, next steps to that, it sounds like some of you are already working on, but what are the water injustices that exist in your community or in your neighbor's community? What is your community's responsibility and capacity to organize for the human right to water? What communities or groups are already working to implement the human right to water? Who are the impacted communities? Are they part of the conversation? Are they leading the way? And what are those impacted communities asking of partners and allies as they work to get their right to water? And then, as Lisa mentioned earlier too, and it's been mentioned throughout, what is the impact of COVID-19 on infrastructure and access for different communities right now? There was a run on bottled water at the beginning of shelter in place, and so individuals that didn't have access to clean tap water didn't have access to any water because there was no bottled water anywhere. And so that's something that we have to start being aware of, the ways in which realities that are affecting all of us also have an even greater impact on some of our neighbors. So that's the human right to water in 47 minutes or less. And, you know, there's a lot more that we could do and talk about. And, you know, I'm always, I would love to continue the conversation with you and your community and the individuals you find yourself working alongside as you dive deeper into what it means to engage the human right to water. But I just wanted to see if there were any further questions or reflections. I know I've been talking at you for a long time now.
I have a question for you. Do you like to be called just Ranwa or Reverend?
Ranwa is good.
Okay. Okay, Ranwa, I have a question about the human right to water. So this idea is connected to one or more of our 7 principles, right? And so when we're doing this work, we're coming from a place of, you know, kind of, not to sound corny, but I want to be a good Unitarian. And I want to know what that means. And so if we get involved with this challenge, I feel like I could now approach it and say, you know, I'm comfortable with getting involved because the Unitarian principles kind of help me to understand, and your PowerPoint just helped me to understand where this challenge is and what it means to really, you know, to really say it out loud. I believe that every person born has the right to water, and so I'm going to live my values accordingly. So I really appreciate this because, you know, I have a lot of questions about expressing my beliefs and sort of not pushing them on others, but kind of explaining to other people about this work. So I really appreciate, I don't know where my question went, but I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. How do we make sure that the cities don't abuse the water?
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, like, for example, when it's raining, they are watering the plants. They are in Newport on a beautiful day. They were opening the fire hydrants and they were flushing them out. So how do we make sure that they don't do things like this?
So that's, you know, that's again that thinking locally, like identifying what your city or your council policies are on that, and bringing that to your local representatives is absolutely one way to do that. I don't know the specific practices that are what is particular to your area that you've been observing, but you know, calling that to your local representative's attention is absolutely a starting place for that. And you know, I would say also checking in with who is responsible again for who makes the decisions about how water is used in your community. I will, when I can send this PowerPoint over to you, and I can also share some links that allow you to start identifying, okay, who makes these decisions in my zip code? What are the policies in my area? There are some really great resources online to start identifying those pieces and starting to get involved.
Because
And I know that there are folks on this call that might have more information on that as well.
I feel like
to your region.
sometimes I feel like they just don't care. You know, they've been doing it so long, and they're just like, oh well.
Ranwa, I do have a question. Can you explain what the collectives or the clusters are?
Sure. So we're going to be sort of building those up in 2021. And so I'll move into, I have to actually hop off in about 2 minutes to start a phone bank because the work of justice is never done. And if you haven't sent out your ballot, please drop it off in the next 24 hours or 48 hours.
Yes.
But so UUJMCA, like I said, we are a statewide action network that works to connect and collaborate with California UU to encourage us to participate in statewide justice education, advocacy, and witness opportunities where we affirm and promote our Unitarian Universalist values. And so these clusters and collectives that will be starting up in 2021 in a more formal capacity are opportunities for Unitarian Universalists in California that are interested in either certain issue areas, so those would be the collectives, to communicate with each other and share, what is the work we're doing, how can we share resources, ideas, potentially collaborate if we're working on the same issue specifically, and just having that community space available to start working together. And clusters will be a space for folks who are in the same region. So for example, if there are others in Orange County or on the coast that you would be working with for certain things, I know that the Poseidon Desalination Project is one of those areas where there are questions and learnings that the community wants to learn more about. And so that's a place where a cluster of folks in the same region can come together.
And you say that's in 2021. Yeah,
that's in 2021. Right now, we've been in over our head with UU the vote. So some of these other pieces have been simmering on a back burner.
Sure.
We'll be building those up and sharing more of that information soon. Yeah, that is a place where folks can connect to each other and start sharing. Another place I do want to lift up is createclimatejustice.net. It is a project, some people may already be aware of it, but it's a project, a collective space that is created by the UU Ministry for Earth and the Green Sanctuary Program, and I believe the UU Service Committee, where UUs interested in climate justice can come together. There are groups with either based on region or community or issue area that you can join and start working, sharing events, sharing resources, really great hub to work off of. So createclimatejustice.net is another place to start getting connected to folks. Yeah. And doing some of this work, this organizing, hosting events and these kind of things like this and posting it and sharing it with people that might be on it.
Yes, and I would encourage everyone to ask Randy Kokel about what's going on in the local area related to water and water issues, and he's a vast store of knowledge.
Well, thank you for all the flattery. Thank you to Lisa and of course to Ranwa. You have been wonderful in helping us understand the human right to water and its history. We are looking at doing other in-church projects. There may be another one in January we discussed. We're going to hammer out the details of what these look like. And thank you, Ranwa. You have just been wonderfully helpful, and I appreciate the time and effort and energy you put into this.
Thank you so much for your time, Ranwa.
Yeah, I'm just going to make 2 quick plugs real quick and then I'm going to hop off and do a phone bank. I wouldn't be a good executive director, Tom's on my board, if I didn't do this. But if you are able to give to support the UU Justice Ministry of California, your donations would be very welcome. We're able to do programs like this for free because of the donations that individuals offer to support our work. So if you want to make a one-time or become a monthly sustaining donor, we would absolutely welcome that support. And so you can go to uujmca.org/give. And, you know, this will allow us to do more of these kind of events with you, with other groups and organizations and congregations. And then finally, I will send this information out to you as well. But if you do want to be in touch about some of our upcoming programs or work, or you are interested in potentially putting together a team to talk about the human right to water at a state level, and start engaging in that in a more state level, that is something that absolutely I would love to hear from you about. And so I will share these slides, and we'll share additional resources. I am about to do a phone bank, but it has been great to be with all of you. Thank you for listening to my dulcet tones for the last 57 minutes.
You sound great.
Thank you,
All
Ron.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Thanks.
for helping with the vote. Go get them, girl. Go get them.
All right. Take care, everyone.